It started as a regular evening. I wasn't even planning to go out that night, but Alex had a way of pulling me into his plans. He was charming like that, confident, funny, and a little too persuasive for his own good. He texted me about a hot tub hangout at Mark's place, saying it would just be the three of us. I wasn't close with Mark, but I'd seen him around a few times. The quintessential straight guy, athletic, laid back, always polite but never too personal. The idea of spending an evening in a hot tub with him didn't feel like my usual scene, but I figured, why not? When I arrived, the setting was comfortable, almost intimate. The hot tub sat under a clear night sky, steam rising into the cool air. Alex greeted me with his usual grin and a drink already in hand. Mark was quieter, standing off to the side, but he gave me a nod and a small smile. He looked different tonight. Not in the physical sense, but something about his presence felt heavier, like he was carrying something he didn't want to share. As we settled in, the conversation started flowing. Alex, of course, took the lead. He had a way of making everyone feel at ease, cracking jokes, sharing stories, and pulling us into his orbit. Mark laughed along, but didn't say much. His eyes kept drifting, and I couldn't help but notice they landed on me more often than not. It wasn't obvious, just a second too long, a glance that felt weighted, but I noticed. I told myself it was nothing. Mark was straight. Everyone knew that. Alex teased him often enough about his ex-girlfriends and his predictable taste in women. But there was something in those glances, something that made my pulse quicken, even though I told myself I was imagining it. Alex, always the instigator, started teasing me too, joking about how I never came out with them, and how it was about time I let loose. His tone was light, but there was a glint in his eye, like he was testing the waters for something more. Mark chuckled, but didn't join in. Instead, he leaned back, letting Alex take the spotlight while his gaze flickered toward me again. As the night went on, the drinks flowed, and the air grew warmer, both from the heat of the water and the unspoken tension building between us. Alex was in his element, effortlessly pulling stories from Mark and me, but I could feel a current running beneath the surface. Every time Mark spoke, his voice was softer, almost hesitant, and every time Alex laughed, it felt like it was covering something unsaid. I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol, the setting, or my imagination running wild, but something about Mark seemed different tonight. He wasn't just the polite, reserved guy I thought I knew. There was a depth to him, a quiet intensity that made me wonder what he was holding back. And as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to find out. The heat of the water surrounded us, but it was nothing compared to the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Alex had that energy where he could make any situation feel like a party, even if it was just the three of us. He kept the mood light with his jokes and his relentless teasing. Most of it was directed at Mark, about his rigid routines, his predictable weekends, his apparent inability to let loose. Mark took it in stride, chuckling softly and brushing off the comments, but I could tell it was starting to wear on him. Alex, of course, didn't stop. "Come on, Mark, you're always so serious. You need to loosen up, man. Maybe take a few lessons from our friend here," he said, nodding in my direction. I laughed it off, but I noticed Mark's reaction. His eyes flicked to me, his expression unreadable, before he looked away again. It was such a small moment, but it lingered with me. The conversation drifted to other things, work, random anecdotes, nothing too deep, but there was an undeniable tension brewing. Mark seemed quieter than usual, his responses short but not unfriendly. It was like he was holding himself back, keeping something just below the surface. Alex, on the other hand, was all energy, almost deliberately trying to fill every silence. It made me wonder if he noticed it too, if he could sense the same unspoken current between Mark and me. At one point, Alex leaned back and grinned at us both. "You know, Mark's not as straight-laced as he looks," he said, his tone playful but with an edge that made me think he wasn't just joking. Mark shot him a look, half amused, half warning, but Alex just laughed. "What?" "I'm just saying, there's more to you than meets the eye." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his arms on the edge of the tub, his face half hidden in the steam. "You don't know everything about me. Alex," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't nothing either. The comment hung in the air, unanswered, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Then Alex, ever the master of deflection, broke the silence with another joke, pulling us back into his rhythm. But the moment stayed with me. It was the first time I'd seen Mark push back, even if it was subtle. As the night wore on, the space between us seemed to shrink. Alex's teasing became more pointed, almost as if he was trying to provoke a reaction. At the same time, Mark's gaze lingered longer, his presence feeling heavier. It was intoxicating and confusing all at once, like being caught in a game I didn't fully understand but couldn't walk away from. By the time Alex splashed water at me, laughing at some joke I barely heard, I realized my focus had shifted entirely. I wasn't paying attention to Alex anymore. All I could think about was Mark, his silence, his intensity, and the growing realization that whatever this was, it was far from harmless. The night had taken on a quieter tone. Alex stepped out for a moment, claiming he needed to grab something from inside, leaving Mark and me alone. The silence felt heavier than the steam rising around us. For the first time all evening, there was no buffer, no one to fill the space with jokes or distractions. It was just him and me. Mark didn't speak at first. He leaned back, his face tilted toward the sky, but his focus wasn't on the stars. I could see his jaw tighten, his hands resting on the edge of the tub, fingers tapping lightly, like he was building up the courage to say something. "I feel like I've been living a lie," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the gentle bubbling of the water. The words surprised me, but I stayed quiet, giving him space to continue. "For years, I've been doing what everyone expects. Acting the way I'm supposed to, saying the things I'm supposed to say." He paused, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before looking away again. "But it doesn't feel real anymore. It hasn't for a while." I wasn't sure how to respond. The vulnerability in his tone was disarming, and I could tell this wasn't something he shared easily. "What do you mean?" I asked softly, careful not to push too hard. He exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. "I don't know. Or maybe I do, but I'm too scared to admit it." Another pause. "It's just, sometimes, I feel like I'm stuck in this box that everyone's put me in. Like I have to stay there, because that's who I'm supposed to be." But then, he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the water. "But then what?" I prompted gently, my heart beating faster. He looked up again, his eyes locking onto mine. This time, there was no hesitation. "Then I meet someone who makes me feel like I could be more than that. Someone who makes me question everything." I knew what he was saying. I knew it even before he reached out, his hand brushing against mine under the water. It was subtle, barely a touch, but it sent a jolt through me. Part of me wanted to pull away, to break the moment before it went too far. But I didn't. I couldn't. "Mark," I started, unsure of what I was even going to say, but he cut me off. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his voice trembling slightly. "I know this isn't fair to you, or to Alex, but I can't stop thinking about you. I've been trying to ignore it, trying to pretend it's nothing, but it's not." The intensity in his words hit me hard. I felt the weight of them, the raw honesty that I hadn't expected. And despite everything, the confusion, the complications, the risk, I couldn't deny the pull between us. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. It wasn't planned and it wasn't rational, but in that moment, nothing else mattered. His lips met mine, and the world seemed to fall away. It was brief, hesitant, but it was enough to change everything. When we pulled back, his expression was a mix of relief and fear. "I don't know what this means," he said quietly. "Neither do I admitted, my voice just as soft. But even as I said it, I knew there was no going back. The silence between us lingered, thick and impossible to ignore. Mark avoided my eyes now, retreating into himself as if regretting everything that had just happened. I couldn't blame him. I felt the weight of it too. The consequences, the questions, the betrayal simmering just beneath the surface. Before either of us could say a word, Alex came back, a drink in hand and a casual grin on his face. Miss me already, he joked, slipping back into the water. But something in his eyes told me he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to sense the shift. The energy had changed. Mark barely said a word after that, his usual reserved nature now amplified into complete withdrawal. Alex noticed, of course, he noticed everything. "What's with you?" he asked Mark, his tone light but laced with curiosity. Mark shrugged, muttering something about being tired. Alex's gaze flicked to me, sharp and calculating. "And you? You've been quiet too. Did I miss something while I was gone?" It was a casual question, but the edge in his voice made my stomach twist. I tried to brush it off, offering some weak excuse about being lost in thought. But Alex wasn't buying it. He leaned back, watching both of us, and for the first time all night, the conversation didn't flow. The tension became unbearable. Mark stood abruptly, mumbling something about needing to grab a towel, and disappeared into the house. I watched him go, unsure whether I wanted to follow him or stay and face whatever Alex was about to say. "You know," Alex said after a moment, his voice low, "I've always wondered about Mark. About what he's hiding." He swirled his drink, staring at the water as if he were talking to himself as much as to me. "He acts like he's got it all figured out, but sometimes I think he's just scared. Scared of what he really wants." I didn't respond, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tell if he was fishing for answers or simply making an observation, but either way, it felt like a trap. Then Alex turned to me, his expression softer than I expected. "And you? I didn't think you'd get caught up in it. But maybe I underestimated you. Or him." The way he said it sent a chill through me. There was no accusation in his tone, but the implication was clear. He knew something had shifted, and whether he was angry, hurt, or just resigned, I couldn't tell. I didn't mean for I started, but he cut me off with a small, rueful smile. "You don't have to explain. It's not my place, is it?" He paused, his eyes searching mine. "But if you're going to be part of whatever this is, just don't let him drag you down. Mark's got a lot of baggage, and if he's not ready to deal with it, you're the one who's going to get hurt." His words hit harder than I expected, partly because they felt true. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and Alex let the silence settle again. By the time Mark returned, the tension between Alex and me had faded into something quieter, more reflective. Mark avoided both our gazes, sitting at the edge of the tub like he didn't belong there anymore. When I left that night, the air was thick with unspoken words. I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same, not between me and Mark, not between me and Alex, and certainly not within myself. It wasn't just about the kiss or the connection. It was about the lines that had been crossed and the truths that could no longer be ignored. Walking away, I realized I didn't have answers. I didn't know what Mark wanted, what Alex really felt, or what this meant for any of us. But one thing was certain, some moments change you forever, and this was one of them.